Welcome back to So You Really Want to Learn Latin, and now for something a little bit different. We've learnt a lot about the Latin language so far, and we know that Latin was spoken by the ancient Romans. But who exactly were the ancient Romans, and where did they come from? Well, traditionally, Rome was founded in 753 BC by Romulus. But of course the story started long before that. The Romans loved to trace their ancestry back into the realms of mythology, back into the world of the Trojan War. The Romans, you may know, were slightly obsessed with Greek culture. And of course ancient Greece had the wonderful tales told by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Romans, wanting to have an ancestry as rich and ancient as that of the Greeks, traced their ancestry right back into the time of the Trojan War. Now you will remember that the Trojan War was a conflict that lasted for 10 years between the Greek armies led by King Agamemnon and the Trojans under their king Priam. It began, according to the legends, after Paris, the son of the king of Troy, went to Sparta and fell in love with the wife of King Menelaus, Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. And if you believe the mythology, this all happened following the judgment of Paris. So, the judgment of Paris was when three goddesses were squabbling over which of them was the most beautiful. They had been at the wedding of Peleus, a Greek king, and Thetis, a sea nymph. And at that wedding, a golden apple had been rolled in to the wedding party by the angry goddess Eris, who had not been invited because she was a goddess of strife. So the three goddesses, looking at this golden apple on which the words "for the most beautiful" had been inscribed, were pulling each other's hair out, scratching each other's faces, desperate to be given the apple as a sign that they were the most beautiful. So Zeus, unable to calm these three goddesses down, sent them down to earth, where they were to be judged in terms of their beauty by Paris, a shepherd boy living on a hilltop outside the city of Troy. Now, of course, Paris wasn't really just a shepherd. He was the son of King Priam. But at the time, he didn't know that, and nor did King Priam. But that's another story. So, the apple was given to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Aphrodite in return promised that Paris could have the most beautiful woman in the world. Okay, so that explains why it was that when Paris had been reunited with his father, the king of Troy, and had been sent over to Sparta to make friends with the Spartan king, why it was that actually Paris, far from making friends with the king, seduced his wife and stole her back to Troy. That explains why there was a war, because all the Greek kings and warriors wanted to seek revenge on the Trojans who had stolen the beautiful queen, Helen, and they formed an army led by King Agamemnon, the brother of Menelaus, and this Greek army consisting, if we are to believe the tales, of 1,000 ships, and they set off to Troy and camped outside the city of Troy and besieged it. And for 10 long years they sat outside the city, and the poor Trojans sat inside the city, and the siege lasted for 10 years. Occasionally the Trojans would come out of their city and fight with the Greeks, and the Greeks would sometimes be pushed further back towards the sea, and then the Greeks would push the Trojans further back towards their city, and the war went on, until eventually, there's all sorts of amazing stories before this final thing happens, but eventually the Greeks have the idea of leaving a wooden horse on the beach and then pretending to sail away. And inside this wooden horse they have hidden a whole band of warriors led by the mighty Odysseus, whose idea this had been. So by night the Greeks sail away, and in the morning the Trojans come out of their city and they find this amazing horse. And some of them say, it's a gift from the gods, we should bring it inside our city. And some are less keen. And in particular, there is a priest called Laocoon who is desperate that they should not fall for this trick. He knows it's a trick. And he says, according to the Roman poet Virgil, Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes, which means I fear the Greeks even when they are bearing gifts. But sadly, Laocoon is ignored, not helped by the fact that as he is trying to persuade the Trojans not to trust this horse, he is dragged into the sea by a sea serpent that comes out of the sea and twines itself around him and his 2 young sons and pulls him back into the sea where he is drowned. And those Trojans who had been keen to get the horse inside their city took this as the final proof that the gods wanted the horse to be taken into the city. Well, the rest, of course, is history. The horse was taken into the city of Troy, and in the night the warriors came out of the horse, they opened the gates, the rest of the Greek army had sailed back under cover of darkness, come out of their ships, marched up to the city, came in through the open gates, and disaster for the Trojans. They set fire to the city, they killed the men, they enslaved the women, and very nearly all of the Trojans were killed. Well, not all, because a prince, Prince Aeneas, instructed by his mother, and I'm now going to swap, if it's all right with you, from Greek names for the gods and goddesses to the Roman names. So Aeneas was the son of Venus, the goddess of love. Venus, who the Greeks knew as Aphrodite, the Romans knew her as Venus. Venus instructed Aeneas to leave the city, taking with him his father Anchises and his son Ascanius, and, most importantly, the household gods, the most sacred objects that the young Aeneas and his family would have owned. And these were to go with Aeneas on his journey to found a new Troy. So Aeneas sets off with his father on his back, his household gods held tightly in his arms, and his young son Ascanius in his hand. He actually needed 3 hands to do all of that, but he seemed to have managed. And he sets off on a journey, and all sorts of adventures are had, and these adventures are written about by the Roman poet Virgil in his epic poem, the Aeneid. The band of Trojans sail west across the Mediterranean, and they, after all sorts of adventures, end up in Carthage, where Aeneas meets the Carthaginian queen, Dido. And there, of course, we have the great love story between Dido and Aeneas. Dido is in love with Aeneas. Aeneas seems to be in love with Dido. But the gods are not happy, and Mercury, the messenger of the gods, is sent to Carthage to remind Aeneas that he has a duty to found a new Troy, a new city, and this is not where it should be. So Aeneas gets up and he calls his people together, and they get into their ships and they sail away. And poor old Dido, waking up in the morning, sees the ships sailing out across the sea. She is heartbroken. She builds a pyre onto which she throws her body, and there on top of the pyre, stabbing herself with Aeneas' own sword, which he had left behind, and the pyre is set fire to. And so Dido, seeing Aeneas sailing away, curses him and the city that he will found. And that curse brought, in a few centuries' time, the war between the Carthaginians and the Romans. Well, Aeneas did get away from Carthage, and he did get to Italy. He has more adventures. He goes down into the underworld. He meets the spirit of his father, and he is shown the pageant of Roman heroes. All the great heroes of Rome, who of course have not yet been born. Rome itself has not yet been built. But the pageant of Roman heroes is led in front of him, and he sees the great heroes who will be great in the age of Rome. And Aeneas is inspired to carry on with his journey and to build the new city. So, travelling further into Italy, he comes across King Latinus. And King Latinus has a daughter, Lavinia, and Aeneas resolves to marry Lavinia and build a new people. But Lavinia's mother is not keen on this plan. She wants her daughter to marry Turnus, a neighbouring chieftain. And so a war develops between Aeneas and his Trojan band and Turnus. And that fight continues for many books of the Aeneid. But eventually, to cut a long story short, Aeneas has a duel with Turnus, and in that duel he defeats him, and right at the end of the book kills him. So Aeneas has won. He has escaped from Troy. He has arrived in Italy, the land where he has been instructed to build a new city, a new Troy. And he marries Lavinia, and he builds a new city which he calls Lavinium. Now, his son, Ascanius, doesn't want to live with his father in this new city, and he resolves to go off and build his own city. And this he does. He goes further up the river Tiber and builds a new settlement at a place which he calls Alba Longa. And it is in Alba Longa, many generations later, that two twin boys are born, Romulus and Remus. But that is another story for another day. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that brief little introduction into the early origins of Rome. There'll be more of these history videos coming up at the end of each chapter in So You Really Want to Learn Latin, just for a little bit of light relief, and so that we know who these Romans were. Okay, see you next time.